So today we'll be talking about Chapter 4, Section 2. The title of this is Ideas Help Start a Revolution. And these are going to be some of the ideas that are fundamental to our country, the ideas that go into the draft of the Declaration of Independence, and ideals that we as Americans still hold extremely highly. First off, the First Continental Congress was formed in opposition to many of the taxes the British had imposed upon the colonists. The Second Continental Congress was formed in May of 1775 in Philadelphia. The purpose of this meeting was to debate whether or not the American colonies should seek independence from Great Britain. And this was a very big deal, because declaring independence meant going to war with the most powerful empire on earth. Can I make another Star Wars reference? Hey, this means going to war with the empire. Do we go there? Do we risk everything? Or do we remain submissive to an empire that was increasingly seen as tyrannical? At this meeting, it was agreed that the militiamen, those who had attacked British regulars, would be formally recognized as the Continental Army. Can you imagine? What if there was a meeting held with representatives from every state, and it was agreed upon that those guys that stole the weapon, not the weapons, but did you hear the story about the group of ranchers in Oregon that stole a federal building? Did anybody hear about that story? That was last year. Yeah. So these guys, a bunch of ranchers, occupied a federal building. True story. About a year ago, they held this federal building for several months. They were surrounded by the FBI. They were surrounded by local police departments. And they holed up in this building for a number of months until they peacefully surrendered. Now imagine that a meeting was held with representatives from every state in the country. And we decided we are going to declare those guys in that federal building in Oregon the new Continental Army. We are going to recognize them not as wackos, which, let's be honest, but as a new army representing the new independent United States of America. That's effectively what we did. Because you have these isolated instances of colonists attacking British regulars, which were the government of the time. So now you have citizens attacking members of the government. And now they are being recognized as the army by this group called the Second Continental Congress. In fact, commander of this army, we all think of George Washington as, well, he's the boss, right? He's on the quarter. So he's not only on the quarter, he's on the dollar. So he must be a pretty big deal. We've named our capital after him. We have a state named after him. Everything's named after Washington. He must be pretty important. He was the Luke Skywalker of his time. He was appointed commander of this rebel army. Now, we have an active rebellion sanctioned by this Continental Congress. But at this point, we haven't gotten much further than, we haven't even blown up the Death Star yet. We have just formed a rebel alliance with George Washington.
All hell brain split.
With George Washington as our commander. And so now that George Washington is in charge, and now that this is not just a series of isolated incidents, it is now a full uprising. The British troops have organized to quell this uprising. This is not the first time the British have dealt with insurrections within their colonies. They are experienced at putting down uprisings. And so the militia had organized just north of the city of Boston, and British troops amassed to attack the colonists there and put down this uprising before it grew any bigger. And this was known as the famous Battle of Bunker Hill. It occurred in the month of June in the year 1775, and the British Army won, dispersing the colonists at great cost. This could have been the end of the revolution. This could have been it, folks. You see, the British won this victory. The colonists had organized. They had armed themselves. They had declared George Washington as their leader. They even had a form of a de facto legislature to recognize their existence formally. And then they were crushed. Not bad, right? Hey man, nice shot. Put up a decent fight. 450 colonists lay dead at this crushing defeat of Bunker Hill. But wait, that's not the end of the story, right? Because we know the rest of the story. Okay, 450 colonists lay dead. The British took the hill. The colonists were dispersed. But 100, not even 100, 1,000 British redcoats lay dead. Even though they took the hill, we painted the hill red with blood. The famous commander, upon the march of the British, ordered his troops to not fire till you saw the whites of their eyes, and so the colonials kicked butt.
Yeah.
While they took the hill, we made them pay for it. Now, meanwhile, Bunker Hill has happened. The revolution is growing. While our first battle was a defeat, it's one we could be proud of. We killed 2 of them for every one of ours. Now, the Second Continental Congress hoped to restore order. In fact, we sent an olive branch. It was called the Olive Branch Petition to Great Britain to, quote, restore harmony. We hoped this secession could be resolved peacefully. That's happened elsewhere. Canada eventually declared independence from Great Britain peacefully. No big deal. Other places have declared their independence from Great Britain peacefully. We hoped to be one of those. And so we send this olive branch to the king himself, King George III. And he says, no way, Jose. In fact, not only does he reject the olive branch petition, he orders a naval blockade of all colonial ports. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. Now, I know you guys aren't probably reading pamphlets today. Many of you don't even use printed newspapers anymore, and that's okay. Information is dispersed in other ways. Think of this as a blog. Thomas Paine had a blog called Common Sense, and it was widely read. Again, before Facebook, before social media, before hashtags, he was publishing his ideas, and they spread like wildfire. In this pamphlet, which just means a short little book, he called King George a tyrant. A tyrant is someone who seizes power illegally without the consent of the people. It's a serious accusation. To accuse a king of a tyrant usually carries the penalty of death. And not only does he call him a tyrant, he puts it in writing. He argues that independence will allow for free trade and foreign aid. He argues that independence can give equal social and economic opportunities to all citizens. And people were reading this, So he makes his case for independence against Great Britain, and he calls it common sense because he says this is the common sense solution to our problems. And his work was successful. Again, he's committed treason by publishing this work. But his ideas spread. 500,000 copies of this were distributed. When you think of a colony with only 13 million people, if that. So these ideas were being discussed, being talked about in colonial homes around the country. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress urged each colony to form their own government. And we'll get into the problems created by that later, but it was time for the colonies to organize. The Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to prepare a formal Declaration of Independence. You know, they asked around. They said, okay, who's good at writing? Thomas Jefferson said, I got this. I might have the biggest library in the country, and actually he did. One of the largest personal library in the country. Dude's a reader. He's a good writer. He's quite brilliant. And so they said, Thomas Jefferson, we're going to put you in charge of writing the Declaration of Independence. You have a small group, a committee of people that are going to help you, but we need this. It's got to be good. And it's got to go to the king himself. And the Declaration of Independence was the formal statement of separation from Great Britain. It's considered one of the best written documents in our country's history. We still have it. The original one signed by Thomas Jefferson himself. You can go see it in Washington, D.C. And if you go on our next D.C. trip, you'll get to see it. I think again, it's not that dramatic. You're going to look at a piece of paper. But when you think of what it represents, it's huge. What was it? Well, essentially it was to explain the reasons for the colonist actions. Why are we rebelling? Why did Bunker Hill have to happen? Why did we dump all that tea? Why are these colonists attacking British regulars? Why are people attacking enforcers of the law? Which, let's be honest, that's what they were attacking. Why were officers being killed by colonists? Now, again, the purpose of this document is so significant. It's so amazing. I actually got chills when I got to see it. I was like, wow, that's awesome. I know it's a piece of paper. It's rotting away. You can barely read it. But when I think about what it represented, you see, it was based on John Locke's ideas. On these old ideas that we have natural rights as human beings. These are rights that no one can take away. No one has the right to deprive you of these rights. I don't care who they are. No government. No officer. No military. No one has the right to take your natural rights away. And these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because when you boil it down, that's what it's all about. That you have the right to be what you want to be, and by gosh, no one gets to tell you differently. And that's what freedom is all about. And what do we mean by liberty? Well, again, it's taken a good 250 years for us to define that word effectively, and we're still working on it. But the fact that we believe as Americans this is what it boils down to, that's a big deal. And again, you can go see it for yourself. I can't read his handwriting. It's a little more, formal, and it's in cursive, and anyway, but I like seeing it. I like thinking, wow, that's what that means. He also goes on to say in the Declaration, again, paraphrasing John Locke, sure, but the fact that this became our declaration. He said that a government exists with the consent of the governed, that we imbue the government with power. We are the ones who give the government the authority to rule over us. And if that government violates that social contract, it voids its right to be a government. I want you to think about that. That if a government violates its social contract to the people, it has violated its right to govern, and it is the people's responsibility, according to the Declaration of Independence, to overthrow that government. It's hardcore. Now, their basis for saying that George had violated his social contract was that we were not allowed to elect representatives in the government that was making laws that we had to follow. Because we didn't get to experience democracy, that government had failed us, according to the Declaration of Independence. Lastly, the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. And I'm sorry, ladies, they didn't actually include all men and women. Though the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 proposed an amendment to the Declaration of Independence to include all men and women. Because let's be honest, he wasn't considering women in that equation when he wrote all men and women. All men are created equal. Because women weren't considered political equals at this time. But we'll get into that on a different day. This was adopted formally on July 4th of 1776, and that's why we do the fireworks on July 4th. It's declared our Independence Day. It's worth pointing out that a number of people did not agree with this idea. There were quite a few people who were against secession at this time. They called themselves Loyalists. They said, no, we don't need to rebel against the British Crown. They felt that independence or democracy could be achieved through the legal process, that people didn't need to die. Some were unaware of events that had occurred. The Boston Massacre was rather polarizing. The incident at Lexington and Concord, rather polarizing. Now that blood has been shed, many people began to make up their minds. You see, over half of the population considered themselves patriots, supporting independence. Some did so for economic opportunity. Some did so for the right to be left alone. Some did so out of ideals. Some did so because their neighbors joined. Various motives, various reasons. But the point is, this movement was growing in popularity. And so the issue of taking sides was rather complicated. Many groups were divided. There were Quakers who were loyalists, who wanted to stay with the British Crown. There were a number of African Americans who were loyalists, who believed their best bet for seeking freedom for their neighbors was loyalty to the British government. The British outlawed slavery long before the United States did. You could make the case that the most freedom would have been achieved for the most people had we stayed loyal to Britain, because Britain outlawed slavery long before, and they didn't have to do it through acts of violence. They did it peacefully. So a number of African Americans wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown. Again, it's not as simple as, let's write a document, let's sign it, yay, let's go kill some redcoats. It's not that simple, because these redcoats had been living among them. Many of them had been living here for a long time. They were neighbors, they were brothers, they were wives, husbands, etc.